Mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue aux séries 2021 de sessions virtuelles de CSPC. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to CSPC SciPol series, new CSPC series for panel sessions, interviews, and discussions on emerging issues of science and innovation policies, begin with a two-day symposium on the federal budget announced last week. But first and foremost, I want to acknowledge the land where I am talking from in Richmond Hill, Ontario. This is the traditional land of the Wenda Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples, whose presence here continues to this day. We will thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. The federal budget 2021 announced last week and is still making news and headlines. To cover the 700 pages budget document, we have gathered 27 panelists from different sectors and from across the country to analyze and discuss the budget with you today and tomorrow. For today's session, we'll all be in one Zoom room. So if you leave and wanted to come back, use the same link to get in. But tomorrow's sessions will begin at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll have a different Zoom link, which you all have received as part of your registration reminder email yesterday. Anytime, if you had any question or technical difficulties, please contact my colleagues at CSPC in the chat line or email info@sciencepolicy.ca. Please note that the chat line can be used for technical issues only, and the questions will be taken only from the Q&A box in the bottom of your Zoom screen. Before beginning the symposium, I would like to acknowledge the work of many people who made today's event possible, beginning with our dedicated volunteers, Aya Abdulayam, Kaila Scott, Victor Lotoki, Sophia Pinea, and the CSPC office, of course, Wendy Zhu, who was the coordinator of the whole event, and Sohasani, who did the magnificent job, and also Alessandra Zimmerman. The symposium will begin by a comprehensive analysis of the budget by Dave Waters, who is no stranger to this crowd and is known for his deep and thought-provoking analysis of the budget. Dave Waters is an economist by training and served for many decades in public service in various departments as Assistant Deputy Minister. And after retirement, he established the Global Advantage consulting firm. We at the CSPC have been so lucky to have him as the board member for so many years, and we'll continue to have him as our strategic advisor in future. I want to thank David, and without any further ado, the stage is yours, Dave.
Well, Meredith, thank you very much, and for your staff for all of the hard work in organizing this. If I can put on the first page of the presentation, please. Great. So the first point I want to make is that in terms of the budget and the title of the presentation here, I really want to focus on one question, and that is whether or not the budget is going to improve the performance of Canada's R&D innovation ecosystem. So that's the central question that really guides the presentation that I will make. And if you can keep that question in mind as we go along throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. Yeah, Meredith is quite right. I mean, this is a very ambitious undertaking to try and in 45, 50 minutes summarize our first budget in 2 years, one that contains unprecedented spending really since World War II, and has as many as 270 new initiatives in it. But we're going to structure it in 5 different ways. One is to look at the macroeconomic context very quickly. That's how usually the first chapter of every budget. And we'll also take into account the impacts of COVID-19. Secondly, we'll look at the performance of Canada's R&D innovation system historically. So over the past 10, 15 years up to the present. We'll then look at budget 2021 investments in particular as to what kind of an impact that they have had. Fourthly, we'll look at the impacts of these budget initiatives in terms of governments in general, in terms of the academic community, universities and colleges, in terms of the private sector, and also in terms of our global trading relationships. And finally, I've got a real treat at the end. I'm going to suggest some significant changes that we should be considering in terms of improving the performance of our research and innovation ecosystem. And I'll phrase these and position these in terms of a menu for your selection. Next, please. So there are five arguments that I want to advance with my colleague Omar Kaya. One is that the budget really doesn't have a long-term economic growth and strategy plan. And this really is a concern, I think, to many of us who see a lot of many initiatives in the budget, but how are they effectively going to be working very often together to achieve a particular result? Secondly, we're going to argue that we're really not investing enough money or in the right initiatives with the research and development innovation funding that is contained in this budget. And there's an historical trend which substantiates that argument. Third, we're going to really talk about the fact that there are new structures that are needed for government to work with the private sector, with the academic community. And the nature of these structures, they must be permanent. They cannot be ad hoc. I think one of the things that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us is that we need these stronger links between key institutions in our society and the public and private sector to deal effectively with the speed with which these challenges, such as COVID-19, arise. So we've got to change the nature of how government actually works with other sectors of the economy. Fourthly, we've got to look at better integration of a whole variety of government policies. The ones we're concerned about: research and innovation programs, industrial support, trade support, and skills. So those are the four basic building blocks that we're going to argue really need to be integrated in order to be effective. Finally, we're talking about implementation. The thing that's interesting in terms of a budget document of 730 pages, let's not forget that those are just words on a piece of paper, and they've got some numbers associated with them. All of that has to be translated into execution and into implementation. And so what many of us are looking for is, well, how are you going, not what are you going to do, how are you going to do it? What are the plans? What are the processes, activities, the schedules to be able to do that? Are you going to have feedback loops to determine whether you're on and off track? As you all know, we've had 6 research and development innovation strategies in the past dozen years. All of them have been fairly weak because we've had every 2-3 years, we have another one that the government comes along with, various governments. And I think the thing that I find missing from all of them is execution, is the resources devoted to actually implementing the great words that you see on paper. Final point here about implementation is I have a great deal of sympathy with the Public Service of Canada, mostly working from home. We're still in the middle of a significant challenge in terms of COVID-19. They have to deliver on the evasive programs that the government has on a day-to-day basis. Now, in addition, there are 270 new ones that they're going to have to try and implement. And I just feel that this is a significant challenge. I mean, a lot of public servants that I know are, a little bit tired, a little bit worn out. I mean, I know everybody is. But to have on this pressure of another 270 programs really is quite a challenge. And then finally, you have the possibility of an election coming up in which, a lot of public servants, et cetera, have to change the orientation and focus of what they do. So this is a real challenge, I think, for government. And my firm belief is that we need to offer to try and help and work with government better. It's interesting that Michael Sabia has done actually precisely that. I'm not sure what kind of a salary he's asking for, but in terms of being the Deputy Minister of Finance, after a very, very long and distinguished career, both the public and private sector, he's trying to give back, and I think we need to think more about doing that. Next slide, please. Next slide, yeah. So every budget begins by looking at the broad macroeconomic picture, and here we're committed to building back the million jobs that we lost, and we're getting very close. There's only about 300,000 that are left. I mean, these are concentrated though in Main Street, as well as particular sectors of the economy, aerospace and tourism, retail, restaurants, and so on, some manufacturing. We've done well in terms of recapturing many of those jobs, but there is still a long way to go, especially with respect to this K-shaped recovery, which refers to the fact that many firms are doing well, but many, and the ones that I just mentioned, the retail establishments, restaurants, and so on and so forth, are really suffering quite badly. In addition, this budget actually makes projections in terms of GDP growth. We've had a significant rebound, but as you look at the budget figures going out to 2023 and beyond, real growth is projected, 2.1% in 2023. It really is slow and slowing down. In addition, we do have a deficit in terms of our trading relationship, and we need to consider then who we're trading with and what we're trading if we want to rectify that. That becomes extraordinarily important because in our view, an innovation strategy has to be an export strategy. Canadian market is just too small. You've got to be looking globally. The primary issue I want to raise here, though, is number two, and that is the debt. And the debt to GDP ratio has increased from a pre-budget mark of about 30%, which was generally a guideline for our degree of economic activity we can take on board in terms of financing it through debt. And it's now up to 51.7%. Don Drummond has written a really excellent commentary on this by pointing out that ratio, in other words, the amount of debt really is there for about the next 30 years. And he says, we've made the assumption that there will not be many significant risks during that period of time, but says in looking at the past 30 years, we've seen, recessions, financial crisis, we've seen, COVID-19 and its impact. We've seen a whole series of risks. And Don really summarized this saying, we don't have an insurance policy. So if you see the two figures out in the boat, we're far from shore, we have no anchor, and we're really taking a big risk in terms of the approach that this budget has set us on. In addition, COVID-19 hasn't gone away. We're still trying to deal with it. We've got the whole issue of rewiring the Canadian economy in terms of climate change and the adoption of digital technologies, that wave that is about to hit us. Next, please. So looking at the impact of COVID-19, boom, this is, an unprecedented event in our experience. And the challenges are the uneven impact on the elderly, on women, on essential workers, on students. I just saw today that there's some ambiguity as to whether or not kids are going to be going back to school, for the balance of this term year. These are stunning issues that we're going to have to deal with that are going to require significant financing. We've also seen the unraveling of assumptions. We had assumptions about how we treated elderly people in terms of old age homes and so on, about the operation of our supply chains, and even about the role of government. And I think COVID-19 and its impact has challenged all of these assumptions. So in fact, now is a good time to rethink. Can we do a better job in terms of some of our fundamental public policy issues, including research and development and innovation? Finally, we have this unprecedented uncertainty. I keep watching about, new variants. I happen to have the Pfizer shot. Is that going to be effective against those variants? Will people go back to work? How long is this, really going to, last? And the nature of those uncertainties then inhibit risk-taking. And I think that's one of the things we need to be careful about in terms of research and development and innovation, because risk-taking is essential to achieve performance in those particular areas of public and private sector. Next, please. One of the things that hit me in looking at the budget, in fact, I was actually quite astounded. I went through it, and it was rare to find any kind of a reference to anything outside the Canadian border. This is a very inward-looking budget. It's very parochial. Some people have even said it's very narcissistic. We keep looking inside the country, and we're doing some great things and some measures, but it's almost like the world doesn't live outside the Canadian border. And in this depiction, you've got a risk just resting outside that border, and it makes me wonder whether or not we're spending enough time and effort in actually trying to monitor the range of those external risks. For example, COVID-19 came from outside our border, and I suspect that we're not. And I'll develop that just further in the next slide. Next, yeah. Here you have the World Economic Forum. They identify 30 key risks risks. They've been doing this for 15, 20 years. I think it's an excellent basis on which to look at risk. They divide them into the 5 categories, and we did just our own top of the mind assessment of the budget in terms of how we're managing these risks. We thought that the economic risk, we would give a D for some of the reasons I mentioned. Societal risk, we gave a B+, maybe it's an A-. I mean, we're really doing quite a good job, I think, in terms of supporting so many groups in society in terms of not only dealing with the crisis, but we've built up a social safety net over the years, which I think is the envy of just about every nation. Environmental risk, I gave a C-. I was actually surprised at how little was going into environmental types of issues in the short run. In the longer run, there's more money, but in the short run, not much. Technological risks, maybe C. I mean, there's some great initiatives in terms of AI and quantum computing and biomanufacturing and genomics and so on. But there are some issues there we're going to get into. And then geopolitical risks, I really didn't feel we were positioning this within a foreign policy structure and a trade structure that's going to be important for Canada. Next slide. This is my own summation of one of the challenges that we face. And it's just asking the question, do we have the right balance between investing in economic growth and social security? Or is the cart before the horse? We'll give you some data in terms of where our expenditures have gone in this particular budget. I think it's about 80% on the social side as opposed to 20% on the economic side. And the question being raised is this enough to really keep the Canadian economy growing? Next slide. This is from my advanced PhD in economics, but it really is looking at sustaining social equity and the fact that you've got to do it with economic growth. So in 2021, I think we've done an excellent job in terms of equitable distribution of economic activity. There's more to be done, and this budget has a whole range of excellent measures to try and do that. But the question becomes, as you look forward to 2030, are you just going to have a status quo orientation in terms of this split between social support and economic support, or are you trying to get economic growth? I think the competitive pressures are such that we really need to focus on economic growth, make the pie bigger for everybody, and then use the social structures we have in terms of its equitable allocation. Next, please. Finally, just don't throw stones from a glass house. The issue here is that I think we were all quite stunned to see some of the problems our American colleagues were having, in particular under the Trump era, in terms of dealing with COVID-19. Beach parties in Florida and anti-demonstrations against the use of masks and so on. But when you look at the data now, and our team just updated this, Canada's not doing as well as the US in terms of the number of cases per million people. I think that's going to raise issues about how government is performing in general. Premier Ford is having some challenges with this. The federal government is having some challenges with it. So I think, it's almost like an episode of Game of Thrones. There's still a lot more to come in terms of how we're dealing with COVID-19. And one of the vulnerabilities is the questioning about, well, how effective are governments and what kind of governments are going to be even more effective. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it now over to my colleague, Omer Kaya, who's going to take you through some of the specifics of the budget. Omer.
Thank you, Dave. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for CSPC, the organization, and all the audience here listening to us for their time. So we've looked at the budget in the context of this and next fiscal year and the spending that's going to be immediately impacting the landscape here. And it really adds up to $77.6 billion over 2 years, according to our analysis. And it is the largest budget in Canadian history. And in comparison, this is indeed 46 times larger than Harvard budget number 4. And before, just prior to the announcement of budget 2021, we had $345 billion of stimulus spending directly as a response to the COVID-19 challenges. And this was also 25 times larger than 2019 stimulus spending. So it is a huge budget that we are trying to decode here. Next one, please. And we've done a comprehensive analysis of the budget. And within this $77.6 billion over 2 years, we identified how much is being spent for the research and development and innovation piece in direct expenditures, as well as the clean economy measures. And according to our analysis, 4.7 billion or 6% of this total is targeted for RDI. And on the other hand, 2.9% or about 2.9 billion or about 3.7% is for the clean economy measures. This is actually a quite remarkable amount of money for RDI. However, the question that we would like to raise is whether this is going to be enough and we have the right balance. Next one, please. Here's the budget expenditures by chapter, ranked from largest to smallest. Chapter 3, the new opportunities for Canadians, is the most expensive piece with about $37 billion. However, most of that money is for childcare. Second big piece is the extension of COVID-19 support programs. So we have the CEWS, CEBA, rent subsidy, EI, and worker benefits. Then interestingly, the chapter on cities and communities comes third largest. As the government really wants to focus on growing the digital and green economy, cities will increasingly play a larger role. And chapter 4 on helping Canadian businesses grow and succeed is where we place the most attention. Next one. Looking at the 10 largest programs, 9 out of the 10, according to our assessment, are largely or primarily actually social expenditures. They account about 70% of the total over 5 years. And the issue is that out of 9 out of 10 or over 95% by the expenditure, programs are really focused on this area. So again, the question is, do we have the right balance? The next one, please. Are we going to be able to come out of COVID-19 stronger and sustain our long-term growth with 20% of economic expenditures? It's just an observation that we would like to raise for further discussion. And if we go to the next slide, we also looked at what have others said about the budget. We've been following some of the top leaders and experts also in this area of economic growth. And as Don Drummond said, very effectively, Budget 2021 leaves Canada awash in debt for more than a generation. Robert Aslan, who's actually in the critical panel with us today, the federal budget has no answers on the question of growth. Andrew Coyne said that from Globe and Mail, federal budget leaves money to all without a path to real economic growth. Similar kind of assessments from Scotiabank, University of Ottawa, and also CFIB in terms of support for businesses. So the key question is really to be able to sustain a positive long-term growth and impact on the Canadian economy. And the general observation and impression is that this budget seems to be not really doing that. Next one. I will actually now turn it over back to Dave for the assessment on the innovation performance in Canada.
Okay, go to the next slide. So here are 2 quotes. One is from the Frascati manual. The function of research is to acquire new knowledge. The reason this is important is that research is an activity, it's an input. It is designed to produce new knowledge. And the question for society is, how are we going to use that new knowledge? And what new knowledge do we need to meet the needs of our citizens? The second is Kevin Lintz. Research is a process that turns money into knowledge, and innovation, the process that turns knowledge into wealth. Turning that knowledge into wealth is critical in order to sustain the social programs that we talked about. Next slide. You've seen this slide before. It's been updated, and what it does, you'll see Canada just to the left of the middle with a red flag, and it shows the bubble is the size of Canadian expenditures on research and development. In Canada's case, it's about 36.8 billion. Relative to the size of expenditures in the US, China, and so on. What this shows actually, if you look at our research and development as a percentage of your gross economic activity, South Korea spends more on research and development than Canada, Japan, the US does. In fact, Canada's about 17th in this particular depiction. The challenge then for Canada is, how do we take advantage of the research and development being done in other countries and access that new knowledge to meet Canadian needs? And this may require a different orientation in terms of the way in which we focus our research and development and innovation expertise. It certainly gives an emphasis to international consortium and partnerships in terms of understanding what other countries are developing in terms of their research activities. Next, please. This is the OECD data that shows over almost a 20-year period now. Well, here, yes, we've got it from 2000. The performance of Canada relative to the OECD. So this looks at, well, how much of your economy are you devoting to research and development? In Canada's case, it goes 1.54%. The OECD average is 2.47%. And so you can see that Canada has a $22 billion gap. In other words, we would have to spend an incremental $22 billion just to devote as much of our resources to research and development as the average OECD country. What you've got then across the bottom is the 6 attempts that we've had to develop a research and development innovation strategy, starting with Alan Rock in about 2001, Joe Rotman, Jim Flaherty, Tom Jenkins, Ed Holder, Baines, and Barton. And it's our belief that we're going to have a new research and development innovation strategy very shortly. And I think that it may be that this budget is actually setting up some of the markers for how we might approach actually improving our R&D and innovation performance. The big issue here is we have a stunning gap. Next slide. This really just, here you see some runners finishing a race, and you'll notice in the top left-hand side, and that's the Canadian who's running in the wrong direction. Our R&D performance in the past 10 years, we're showing a 15.8% decline. The OECD competitors on average, 9.7% growth. Why are we doing this? Do we understand this? Is this acceptable? Or do we want to change it? Next slide. Here you can see the same slide with the $22 billion gap, and then some of the assessments in terms of our performance. And everybody is familiar with these. ISED quotes these, most major banks quote these. I mean, this is data, these data sets are known. And when you look at the Global Innovation Index, the last 3 on inputs, Canada does well, extraordinarily well in terms of our universities and how many people we have, taking post-secondary education and so on. Our outputs are quite, well below average, but it's the transition. It's actually the ability to take those inputs, and those are the outputs that you're getting, which really put us into a failing kind of category, about 59th in the world. Next slide. So again, these challenges are well known. This is the 2018, the Council of Canadian Academies report. I'm not going to read it, but you'll see the statements in terms of the challenges we have, really in all significant areas of research and development. 2019, next slide. You have the, next slide. Yeah, the acknowledgement of this this was an ISED report, Building a Nation of Innovators. Canada will fall even further behind, putting its high quality of life at risk. So the issue, I think, is known. Then what I found interesting, next slide, John Nubley, who was the Deputy Minister of ISED for the period 2012 to 2019, in a report he did on building super clusters for the Brookfield Institute, noted the problems that he found in terms of our approach, that we're relying on supply side support for science and universities. It wasn't working. Alarmingly, Canada was falling further behind in all measures of the global innovation technology race. I mean, I applaud John for making a statement like that, because we need to start with this understanding of how poor our performance has been, how we're going in the wrong direction compared to most OECD countries, and just ask ourselves, is this what we want, or do we want to change? Next slide, please. Yeah, this looks at labor productivity. I think most of you are familiar with the data. There's about a 27% gap between Canadian and USA productivity. This has been growing over a period of time. It can fluctuate. There's no question about that. But overall, it has been growing. And the reason that's important is if you can go to the next slide. This is the logic diagram, which takes you from the red area, which is entrepreneurial innovation, or what's called multi-factor productivity with its 4 components, all the way up through the components of productivity, which are labor and capital and how they're linked together, to increasing your competitiveness against other countries in terms of global sales and so on. This is reflected in standard of living and then in quality of life. You can take every budget measure and you can slot it into one of these particular groupings. We've done a lot in terms of quality of life. There's more money for the arts, for communities. On standard of living, the government's objective again is to increase those who can access the middle class. And the middle class is determined by GDP per capita. So this is an economic measure that one is using. The wage support measures in the budget, the unemployment support measures, the old age security support, these are all directly hitting that standard of living. If you look at what we're doing for competitiveness, it's hard to find anything. And if you look at productivity, we do have a range of measures. On the capital side, you can see the digital technology adoption program. You've got tax write-offs to invest in new capital equipment. On the labor side, you've got the childcare expenditure, which will permit more women to access the labor force. But you've also got a variety of other initiatives. There are a whole series. They're looking at work integrated learning, so trying to improve the quality of the labor force that you've got as well. And this then all centers around the mix between labor and capital, how to do it differently, how to do it in a more imaginative, constructive way, to try experiments in how you do that to improve the total innovation of your system, to make the circular flow keep running, and to keep the quality of life that you want sustainable. So that point then about productivity is still being essential, I think, is one of the key elements we need to understand as we try to improve the performance of our innovation system. Next slide. Yeah, Peter Nicholson, I think one of our absolute leading experts, made this comment that more important economically than world first innovation is the speed and efficiency of the diffusion of innovation to and within Canada. He's talking here about technology adoption, and I think we need to understand the orientation that he's taking here. It's not just about building a better mousetrap, the first one to do it. If that technology is available, then try and deploy that technology across your country, and that falls within the standard definition of innovation. So I think Peter was just reminding us of this key feature. The next slide, please. Keeping that in mind, what Peter said, one of the things that I've noticed in terms of a lot of support we give for innovation is that it's target to company. So the SIF fund targets an individual company. In fact, only 85 of them have received over almost $3.5 billion, only 85 companies. Other countries do it differently. They actually don't give the money individually. They will have programs that will support collective activity. So here you have 50,000 members, SME members of what's called one of the Mittelstand organizations in Germany, in which they all receive the benefits of pre-commercial research and development. And so you can take a sector of the economy, ask them, well, what are the challenges you're facing? Do collective research that they can all benefit from. And I think Peter is hinting at maybe we should be experimenting a little bit more with some of these kinds of alternatives. So I think that's it, Omer, for this section. So over to you.
Thanks, Dave. So let's have a closer look at the Budget 2021 research, development, and innovation investments that we have put together for you. Yeah, thanks, Shannon. So we looked at both the key research initiatives and key innovation initiatives. And in terms of research, what we are seeing is that the Tri-Councils and the CFI received actually substantial amounts to support research activities. So there's 500 million over 4 years for CFI. And also for Tri-Councils on biosciences research. So one observation is that there's quite an emphasis on biosciences and the health area broadly. Key strategies were also funded. So looking at genomics, quantum, and AI, and portion of that AI is for research, portion of that is for commercialization, are some of the notable investments in terms of research. When we look at the innovation piece, as SIF received the largest top up, so that's 7.2 billion over 7 years. And just to note that 5 billion of that 7.2 is actually for net zero accelerator or for clean tech area. What is really encouraging is support provided for the SMEs and their technology adoption. In the area of greening our economy, there are not many targeted initiatives. We have the CIPS 5 billion and 220 million over 5 years for NRCan. So these are the two largest innovation initiatives for that matter. Next one, please. So we kind of summarized it in one chart here, looking at the RDI programs, and they are mostly focused on economy, as one would expect. And we identified actually a total of 31 initiatives for this area. What is interesting is the amount supporting environment directly. There is about 3.5 billion over 5 years. So the key question that we may want to really think about is whether this will be enough for reviving and cleaning our economy. Next one. Again, so here's the full list of RDI initiatives, and looking at the top 5, it's very clear that we are really doubling down on CIF here. And second and the fourth largest are on technology adoption. So we have the digital tech adoption through BDC. That's on a cash basis. And we also have the helping SMEs move into the digital age, and that's through ISED. The third largest is actually a tax-related support, which would allow businesses to allow immediate expensing of about 1.5 million for eligible investments. Hopefully this will spur business investments. The fifth largest is actually MyTax support, funding for MyTax to support the business community, as well as the training of high quality talent. And that's about $700 million over 5 years. So that's the fifth largest initiative that we have identified. Next one. And in terms of the new technologies, the budget supported the key areas of these new technologies. And the issue is, I guess, how are we organizing to manage the next wave of the technological disruption and their impacts on jobs, skills, training, and so on. So that may be the next wave in this area. And the question is actually how are we going to be managing that going forward? But the support given to key areas of technology is quite encouraging. Next one. Then I think the discussion is into what is our ecosystem trying to achieve. Here are the key results that we put together that the government is targeting. And there are 4 key categories. There's the economic results, environmental, there's social and equity and diversity results. So the question really comes down to, can the government deliver? For example, we have less than 4 years away from growing the value of our exports, both goods and services, by 30%. And we are also less than 10 years away from reducing our GHGs by 40 to 45%. Next one. Yeah, so let's get into very quickly key pieces of the ecosystem and see how they're impacted by the budget. So this is just for background, the flow chart of how R&D flows within the ecosystem. So top row shows you the source of funding, and the bottom row shows you the key performance of R&D. And the federal government is the source of about $7 billion of R&D funding. Most of this money flows into higher education sector, as you can see with the red arrow. Same thing goes for the provincial government. Most of their funds go to the red bubble. And the intramural R&D, the R&D that is actually performed within the government is about $2.5 billion a year. So if you go to the next one, and this actually has been declining. So we observe that this downward trend is actually also happening at OECD and the US. However, the Canadian decline has been sharper, and currently the government expenditures on R&D needs an additional $2.9 billion to reach an average OECD countries governed metric. Next one. Here, let's take a closer look at the federal science-based departments and agencies. The x-axis shows you the intramural R&D, again, conducted in-house, and the y-axis shows you extramural R&D. The size of the bubble reflects the size of the total intramural and extramural R&D. This is data from Statistics Canada, the latest one. It is clear that the National Research Council is the department with the biggest intramural R&D budget and performance. Next one. Let's now at NSERC. CERC, CIHR, and CFI here. As you can see in yellow, these agencies are primarily engaged in extramural R&D, and most of their funds are transferred to universities and researchers. Next one. And this is based on the latest main estimates from the federal government, and we put together the key federal programs supporting Canadian R&D and innovation. As you can see, the Tri-Councils and the CFI in yellow are ranking pretty highly. Besides them, we have the NRC, except IRAP is the fourth biggest portion, and then the CFI comes next, and after, actually CIF comes next, sorry about that, and CFI, and then NRC, IRAP, and most of these actors were actually funded through this budget. Next one. Now let's look at the government expenditures on R&D and HERD, higher education R&D, since 1981 in comparison to the United States. As you can see, the light red shows the Canadian HERD, while the darker red represents the GovERD. So if you look at about 35 years ago, once upon a time in 1984, Canadian GovERD was actually higher than HERD. And since then, they've been moving away from each other in different directions. So one question to think about is whether increasing HERD came at the expense of declining government expenditures for intramural R&D. Next one. Let's quickly look at the impact on provincial and municipal governments. We observed that the provinces are assuming a lot of debt while they are trying to manage COVID. They added about $200 billion new debt to their existing $700 debt. And the projection is that it's going to be $900 billion. And the federal support seems to be fairly large. $3 billion and $4 billion were given in this budget for the healthcare system, also for recovering the healthcare system, but also establishing standards for the long-term care, which are very welcome. But prior to the budget 2021, there was another $23.1 billion for the Safe Restart Agreement, Safe Return to Class, and support for vaccination efforts. One key implication for these communities is actually how federal and provincial negotiations will unfold going forward. So we are yet to see that. Next one. Similar story with actually the cities and respect to municipalities' budget deficits. They are assuming large amounts of deficits in this process of managing COVID-19. Perhaps it's not news to anybody, but perhaps a more interesting picture is the support actually they are getting through the budget. So the Permanent Public Transit Fund is the largest, about $6 billion. And we have the affordable housing through the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and also the Community Building Fund. That's through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Gas Tax Fund. So these are measures directly supporting cities. Next section is, let's look at the higher education sector. Next one. It looks like a small portion of our economy. Our calculation is about 2.4%, but it actually produces talent for 100% of all economic activity. Next one. So what has been the support actually for the higher education sector? We put together some updates in that respect. Key research initiatives, some of them are repeat, but just to put it in the right kind of placeholder stakeholder group. 500 million over 4 years for CFI, and we have the Tri-Council Biomedical Research Fund. In addition to that, there is about 52 million over 2 years to support applied R&D projects in collaboration with businesses through EdCERC, which is great to see. And in terms of other initiatives supporting the sector more broadly, we have more kind of student grants coming, and we are also having more support to relieve the student debt. Also French immersion and support for Indigenous students are all welcome initiatives. Next one. So this shows the federal support for universities versus colleges in terms of their R&D, R&D performance, and budgets. Again, 52 million over 2 years for applied R&D is really welcome, and that should help to some level to increase the 75 million that this community is getting according to the latest data. So perhaps more support needs to be actually done to move in that direction. Next one. So let's look at the businesses and industry. So when we take a closer look at the private sector, it is probably no news to anyone that we are really a nation of small businesses, and our business sector does not spend really sufficiently on R&D. However, when you look at the top 10 largest corporate R&D spenders, the energy and oil and gas sector actually comes at the top, accounting for over 20%. So that is really to rewire their operations for the greening our economy. That's, we thought it's an important aspect to note. Next one. Again, in terms of key updates for the business sector, CSPC is the largest support program for businesses. Then we see a SIF program, then incentives through the tax system as mentioned earlier. So these are the top 3 support for businesses. Next one. And for small businesses as well, lots of support for their transition to the digital age. Also to note is money given to the regional development agencies and NRC IRAP to actually support this transformation. Next one. In terms of training and work integrated placements, there are 10 key programs, measures. 5 of them are for youth to actually try to address the issue with youth unemployment, and 5 other for the core working age group. So it's actually a massive support, about 5 billion to create 500,000 new placements and opportunities. And of particular note here is actually the MyTax remarkable money that it got through one of these initiatives, 700 over 5 years. Next one. So the one question is, interestingly, looking at the vertical industrial sectors and horizontal technology platforms, and which one is actually the budget is trying to support more. And we see more targeted kind of focus on the horizontal technology platforms as opposed to vertical industrial sectors, according to our observation. Next one. And some of these key initiatives from 2017 onwards, one is the economic strategy tables and the other one is the superclusters. And we'll actually have further discussions on these 2 key measures. We only saw 60 million over 2 years for the superclusters. So that's to mostly cover the COVID-19 related expenditures. And there's interestingly no reference to the 9 economic strategy table. So it gives a bit of an uncertain picture. So with that being said, I will turn it back over to Dave for the next section.
Okay, next slide.
Just Dave, thank you. And Omar, I just want to mention that we have up to another maximum 8-9 minutes for the presentation, and I hope you can capture all the discussions within that time frame. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go very quickly. I want to talk about what I call the Trojan horse syndrome. I think you're all aware of it in terms of how Troy was captured by the Greeks with the Greek soldiers inside the horse. Next slide. The thing I just want to mention here is one of the issues that's emerging, and there was a very interesting article in Research Money about the SIF program, is the issue of foreign controlled sectors of the Canadian economy. And here you have a summary of those sectors: manufacturing, almost 54% foreign controlled, wholesale trade 45, mining and quarrying except oil and gas 43, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. Yeah, the issue is, I think that we need to begin to look at this, that COVID-19 has raised the issue about essential goods being produced in Canada, personal protective equipment, vaccines, and so on. It's challenged the question about supply chains that we have, and wondered, well, what control do we have over many of the private sector institutions that receive benefits from the federal government? I think there's a general issue here that needs to be examined. And so we're just saying, someone should do this, probably an objective third party, because it's emerging, I think, with an increasing frequency. Next slide. And the slide after that. So now we're going to get into trade. And again, I'm going to be very, very quick here. One of the issues is Canada really needs to understand that it doesn't have a lot of friends out there in terms of the trading relationships that we have established and some of the geopolitical challenges that we have. Next slide. Next. Here, just go back one, please. Yeah, here are some of the initiatives primarily focused on internal trade, and that is important. So national trade corridors, removing barriers to internal trade, but there really was not a great deal in terms of our trading relationships. Next slide. This is just to remind you that in red, we see the size of Canada. We see our major trading partners and the size of their populations. And that's why in terms of Canadian innovation, we've got to be looking at global markets in order to sell those products and services. Next slide. This really just shows the weakening trade balance that we have in Canada over a sustained period of time and the impact of COVID-19 on that. Next slide. Here we look at our major trading partners. So the US, Biden is an unknown. Trump was a staggering, stunning problem for us. We renegotiated, in effect, NAFTA. Look at China as our next largest trading partner and the problems that we've got there. And then the United Kingdom, our third largest, and it's trying to still solve how it's going to deal with Brexit. So our key trading partners are really a problem for us, and we need to look at diversification. Next slide. When we look at what we're trading, energy products and motor vehicles and parts, that comprises well over a third. What are we going to replace those with in the longer term as we make transitions to a less G&G carbon-based intensive world in the future? And I think we need to begin planning for it because these changes would require massive shifts in investment. Next slide. Similarly, you can see the impact that we've had already in terms of our trade and services. Travel is down a stunning amount, transportation down a stunning amount. So again, how are we going to increase and use innovation to increase our exports, both in the goods and the service sector? Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at developing a new innovation strategy for Canada. I think just skip beyond that slide. We'll just go to the next one. Next slide. Yeah, good. I wanted to just give you a quote from Michael Sabia. He made this when he was leading a business group to the G20 meeting in Argentina in 2018. Governments individually and collectively are increasingly unable to respond effectively to many of today's urgent issues. And then to his credit, he says it's time for others to step up. And Sabia certainly has absolutely done that. He took over the head of the Infrastructure Bank for a number of months and now DM of Finance Canada. And it's that idea of trying to help the government in terms of many of the challenges that it's facing with these complex issues. Skip the next slide and just go to the one after that. So just skip that. What I want to talk about here then is one of the measures to try and make this improvement in our performance. And to me, it's to make permanent the economic strategy tables. Next. And permit those tables to integrate a sustainable industrial strategy. Our trade strategy needs to be integrated as well. So which industry sectors are priorities? To sell products in what markets? Where will we innovate? Is it startups, scaling up, scaling out? Is it a technology adoption? Is it tech platforms versus sectors? And then what skills are we going to need in order to be able to innovate effectively in those particular markets and support those particular sectors? And I think the digital skills we're going to need, the collaborative leadership, diversity management I would include within there, sales and marketing, absolutely essential. So this gives you the structure around the permanent economic tables. Finally,
2 minutes.
Next. Yep. So here's the menu to improve Canada's R&D innovation performance. It has starters, it has main dishes, and it has ends with dessert. On starters, let's set a national objective. The UK just set an objective of 2.5% of GDP. And again, by 2030, we should be looking at something similar to fill the gap. We need to establish a process to achieve the objective. I think it should be the 9 economic strategy tables. I think we need to reframe the question about research. It's a function to produce new knowledge. So what new knowledge do we need? Fourthly, I think we need to set performance targets inside each of these economic strategy tables, looking at spending measures, tax measures, regulatory measures, and procurement. Let's look at the mains now. Next. Next. Mains. So the first one is integrating these 4 national policies that we looked at: innovation, industrial strategy, trade strategy, and skills strategy. Rather, right now, we've got hundreds of programs, and from the point of view of the private sector, they don't know what's out there that they might access. We need to look outward. We need to look at the incoming global risks, and the World Economic Forum assessment is a good place to start. We need to move from startup to scale and scale up to scale out. We need to have a more widespread diffusion of both research and of the use of new technologies. And fortunately, we've got some good new programs that the government has put into place, digital technology adoption there. I think we need to rebalance our game from defense to offense. Remember Gretzky saying about go to where the puck is going to be? We need to really give more support, I think, for economic growth as opposed to social equity. And it's just a rebalancing. It's not to replace these things, but just to change the emphasis. And I think we need to encourage locally produced food. In other words, we need to look at this issue of, are we assisting foreign controlled firms? And is that what we really intend to do? There's some evidence that that in fact is the case. Now let's look at dessert. 2 elements here. I mentioned the fact that the failure of so many of the previous plans was on implementation. You know, planning is great, but planning is nothing unless you implement it effectively. So for each of these economic tables, we need implementation metrics to look at milestones, measure performance, take stock, and make adjustments. The final thing is that after reading, offer to help clear the table. And again, it's this issue. I think the public service is in a very challenging situation, dealing with COVID-19, dealing with the A-based programs, dealing with 270 new programs, unprecedented in this budget, and with the possibility of an election. So I think if we can offer some help to the public service, that we should try and do that in making changes to the overall system. So that's it, Mehrdad. So enjoy the meal and drive safely. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave and Omer, for this magnificent presentation. I'm sure that you know that there are a lot of questions lined up already for you. And so I just want to ask Soha, please, to add the link to the agenda of the symposium so that people understand what other sessions are coming up. But before also going to the next, to the line of questions, I want to ask to launch the first poll about the participants' demography. And I really appreciate the participants to answer the questions on this poll. It always helps us to know the audience and to perform and do better in future sessions for them. Very much appreciate taking 30 seconds of your time answering these questions, which again, at the end of the day, helps us to perform better for the community. And I thank you in advance for that. So Dave, we have very little time for Q&A, but I appreciate if you go through them and you answer, provide a short answer to them. And we stay as much as we can, but the next session starts at 1:15. So the first, and I go, by the way, the order of the liked on the questions and comments, by the way, so we'll go with that order. So the first one was some disagreement with your statement about the Tri-Council received the largest amount of research funds. They received a large amount of targeted research funds, not wide open discovery funds for them to allocate as they saw fit. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's an interesting observation. I don't know if there's a hidden perspective in the question. In other words, is the questioner thinking that this is inappropriate, or is he concerned that there isn't enough money going into general research, for the researchers? The thing that I've noticed is that in previous budgets, I've analyzed this, that the amount of money that the Tri-Councils get in many years has not taken into account even inflation. To me, I've been concerned that the councils themselves have, and I understand it, have always thanked the government for the assistance. If you look in total at the amount of money that we're spending on research and development in Canada, this $22 billion gap, we're nowhere near, we're not remotely near what the average OECD country is spending. Now you can then look at the question, should that be allocated, to targeted research as opposed to untargeted research? I think you need both. I think the real issue is how well are we supporting the research community? What more might need to be done? But then with the qualification that it isn't about just producing new insights and new knowledge. For society as a whole, with public money, you need to actually make that new knowledge useful. As you know, the UK has an approach where 25% of all of the assessment of research is on how effectively you're actually communicating that to others outside the academic community. Maybe that's the model we should follow. I think these are big issues, though, that need much more detailed examination. Thank
you. And there's a comment also that the quotes that you mentioned about the budget are from usual suspects or old men. We may want to diversify this in future time if there you have any comment on that, but there are a line of questions. I want to move fast to the other questions. Any comments, Dave, on that one? No, I mean, I've looked at, many quotes in terms of you can't obviously put them all here. We're trying to advance an argument that, my father's an immigrant to this country. I'm a stunningly proud Canadian. I mean, I know your history as well. And look at in Omar as well, that we want to keep this, this social paradise that we built, but you have to have economic growth in order to do it. It's a simple message, and we're not investing enough in it. So, okay, that's good. So is childcare program primarily a social measure, but on the long run, a way to create economic growth as we have seen in the last decades in Quebec? What are your thoughts on that? Well, I think it's a fascinating issue. And as you know, there have been many significant debates that have taken place about that. I noticed that Minister Freeland in her budget actually characterized it as more of a social program. I totally get the argument, absolutely. Including I'm a parent and a grandparent, and looking at the extended family of how important this kind of program is to permit women to access the labor force on a more reasonable kind of basis. So, and I understand totally that then obviously has an economic impact, absolutely. So I think there's a very strong argument to advance that. Part of the issue that you get into in detail, though, is who's going to get the money? Do wealthier people get this? Do they need it? Et cetera, et cetera. So there are a bunch of issues like that, and especially as you look at the demographics in Quebec. Excellent. Okay. On slide 50, the important point to note is the only program that had answered to receive new funds was the College and Community Innovation Program. And to the how important would such a small sum, 46.9 million, be a fact for a sector that comprises 120 community colleges and polytechnics? So basically, they're arguing that this fund is not sufficient and it's very minimal to insert for this community. I am a big supporter of applied research through the colleges. Our own staff have benefited from this program, and many of our staff actually are college graduates who came to us through the applied research program. So I think there's a stunning opportunity here. I mean, I would double, triple, or quadruple that amount of money. And let me just go back to the basic issue. The gap is 22 billion. Look at the amounts of money that we're spending on so many parts of the, in this budget. The 46 million, gets lost in the totality of all of that. Can we afford it? Sure, we can. We just have to determine, well, what are the priorities that we think are appropriate? Okay, a general question: is the focus too much on the budget? Is the focus too much on relying on companies, not universities, to conduct R&D? What mandates do they have for doing the right thing for Canada? Does all future university research have to be a partnership between industry and university? And all new money to the tri-agency was targeted?
I mean, I think this goes back to the issue of the apportionment between basic research and applied research and development. The US Congressional Office came out with a very interesting study and assessment of some of these issues quite recently, Meredith. And I think the figure is that it's about 30% of research really is basic research. So the issue isn't one or the other. The issue is, do we have the right balance? And there's no question about the importance of basic research. Research is global, so you need to sort of identify, well, what are the areas that may be most important in the longer term for Canada's needs. There are many specific examples of that that I could give in the health area. If you've got challenges in terms of Aboriginal diabetes, is all of your research going into general research that may exclude some of the impact in terms of those communities? So you need to find the right balance, especially if you're using public money. It should be serving a broad public purpose. So, I mean, the question is balance, and the issue then is, do we have the right balance? Just by the way, COVID-19 has brought to our attention that we don't live in a theoretical world. We live in a very practical world, and that we need to make sure that we are sensing and responding to significant threats that are out there with the use of public money. So that is just another factor that I think needs to be taken into account.
Okay, so another general question that, given the broad consensus, is that this was, by the way, this is the opinion of the sender of this question, that this was a pre-election budget, and given the likelihood of waves 4 and 5 of the pandemics, and these are more aspirational in the budget, and for real numbers, we should look at the fiscal year of 21-22 funds. What do you think about that?
Well, I think I would agree very much that this is an aspirational budget. Very quickly, my first job in government in 1972 was to look at the Indian fifth five-year plan. As a young economist, I analyzed it, and I was just stupefied at the rigor of its objective of achieving full employment. It was a brilliant document. And at the end of this 200-page document, I went back and had a look at it recently, it was a little paragraph. We must take steps to implement this plan. That told me right away that the plan was incapable of being implemented, and in fact, a few years later, it was nothing. A budget is just a plan. What you need is effective execution and implementation, and we are missing all of those components to me when I look at so many of the initiatives. Now, it's not fair to think that you're going to have those necessarily in a budget, but it highlights the importance of the discussion about going from what you want to do as a country to, well, how are you going to do it? And making sure you don't bite off too much. So to me, when I look at 270 programs, Meredith, good luck with that. Imagine the number of Treasury Board submissions, the number of CAB docs you're going to have to go up, the number of ministerial consultations. None of this has really been, so many of these programs have not been consulted upon because of COVID-19 and staying at home with the stakeholder groups. How are you going to do that effectively? I mean, you've got a recipe for gridlock, and then you add on that the possibility of an election, and it's just like, wow, good luck with that. I can't hear you, Meredith.
Thank you, Dave. A specific question about on the issue of herd versus governed. It might be useful to wonder whether the divergence between the two and the net lower spend on intramural federal R&D led to some of the failures of the federal response to COVID-19, a long-term study. So just this is a comment, obviously, if you have any ideas around that, please.
Well, it's a good comment. I mean, I think issues like that should be investigated and looked at, Meredith. I think in general, there are so many lessons from COVID-19. I mean, this is a transformative experience in all of our lives that we need to make sure we can examine. And I would be looking at roles for SHRC and NSERC and CIHR, obviously in terms of trying to look at a variety of those issues and as well as other organizations like the Council of Canadian Academies in terms of some of the questions it can begin to explore from our experiences in dealing with COVID-19. So good point.
Thank you. Before going to the next perhaps section, I want to ask CSPC office to launch the last poll on how did we perform on this session. Please rank us with your answering to this question. Just one question of our, yes, there you go, how we perform. We appreciate your response. Again, it helps us to do better in future. And Dave and Omer, we covered a lot of questions. There leaves a lot more to answer. However, the next session will start and will begin at 1:15. There is a panel of remarkable panelists to discuss your presentation, Dave, and I hope you stay for the discussions, and there will be Q&A for that section and then later on we will have the super clusters and I guess the business sector response to these comments and analysis and overall on the budget. And I want to thank everyone for participating in this session. Any final word from David and Omer before going into health break? And then we begin at 1:15. Dave and Omer.
Yes, thank you very much, Omer. The main issue that I would like to raise, everybody I'm sure in this call wants to improve the performance of our research and development and innovation system. And I think the COVID-19 experience and the transition we're going through gives us an opportunity, I think, to go back and check some of the assumptions that we built into the approach that we've taken. Maybe they're valid, maybe they need to be changed. What are some of the areas in which we can find agreement to do it? So the objective that Omer and I have is to try and give some evidence to start that dialogue. So that's the main point that we really want to do. We want to start a dialogue. And the second issue is we want to include the government in the dialogue. So that point about Michael Sabia leading the way and who wants to, at the age of, I don't know, what is he, 62, 63, become Deputy Minister of Finance Canada? I mean, anyway, it's quite remarkable, is that the government, I think, needs some help and we need to offer to try and work with it, the various institutions we come from to try and find solutions. So dialogue and let's work together.
Thank you very much, Omer and Dave, for excellent and remarkable presentation.